Okay, so you hear all the time that online learning levels the playing field, right? Like it should give everyone an equal shot at a good education.
Right.
But is that actually true?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Mm.
And it's something this research paper, the same course, different access, really digs into.
Ooh, I like it already. So this deep dive is taking us all the way to South Africa. What's the story there?
Well, we're diving into the experiences of students at the University of South Africa, UNISA, trying to understand how the digital divide actually plays out in a distance learning context.
So not just whether students have internet access or not, but like the how of it all.
Exactly. It's about so much more than just checking a box. This research unpacks how the where and the how of getting online can really make or break a student's chance at succeeding in their studies.
Okay, so let's set the scene. When we talk about the digital divide in South Africa, what are we actually talking about?
Well, imagine trying to submit an assignment or just keep up with your coursework when only 22% of the population has reliable internet access.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, you compare that to, say, the UK with 92% or the US with 89%, and you start to see the scale of the challenge.
Yeah, that's a completely different ballgame.
No.
It's no wonder this study talks about a gradation of haves when it comes to digital access. Like, it's not as simple as have and have-nots.
It really isn't.
Yeah.
And that's one of the big takeaways from this research.
Okay, so walk me through these different levels of access. What does it actually look like for students?
So this study zeroes in on what they call material resources, the tangible stuff, computers, internet connections, and crucially, where those things are available. They compare students in urban areas versus those in more rural communities, and the differences are pretty striking.
Okay, so urban versus rural students, hit me with the breakdown.
So in urban areas, home is where the access is at. 62% of male students, and even a bit higher for female students at 66%, say they have computer access at home. Home internet access, while not as common, was still more likely for students in those urban areas.
Okay, so at least for those students, they're not too far from that ideal study setup. But what about their rural counterparts?
It's a different story for sure. Think work first, then maybe UNISA Center, and only then if they're lucky home.
Wow, so it's almost like home access is the last resort for these students.
Yeah, you could say that. And ironically, while public internet access is statistically higher in rural areas, it's not without its own set of challenges and limitations. But we'll unpack that a bit later.
It's interesting, right? More public internet access in rural areas, but that doesn't necessarily translate into a better learning experience. I feel like I'm already sensing a quality over quantity theme starting to emerge here.
Absolutely.
But before we get to that, I'm really intrigued by another layer the study uncovers: age.
It is interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. You'd think the younger generation, those so-called digital natives, would have the upper hand when it comes to digital access.
You'd think so, wouldn't you?
But this research is telling a different story.
It really is. It turns out that the older students, those 28 and up, are actually more likely to report having both a computer and internet access at home.
Now that's a twist. I totally would have put money on it being the opposite. Why do you think that is?
Well, it goes back to that whole gradation of haves idea. Think about it. Older students are often further along in their careers, meaning they might have more financial resources to be able to afford a computer and internet at home. Younger students, on the other hand, they're more likely to still be dependent on their parents or those public access points we talked about.
It's easy to forget how much those financial factors come into play.
Yeah, one 23-year-old male student in this study who lives in a small town, he said he relies on his friend's Wi-Fi just to download his course materials. Can you imagine?
It just goes to show that even within the same university, enrolled in the same courses, students are having such vastly different experiences based on something as basic as where they can log on. It's not exactly a level playing field.
And that uneven terrain, unfortunately, it becomes even more apparent when we factor gender into the equation.
Oh no! Don't tell me there's a digital gender gap at play here too.
Well, it's a good question to ask. Unfortunately, the data does point to a gender gap in digital access, even in these distance learning environments like UNISA. Across the board, female students were more likely to say they're using computers and internet access that they own privately compared to their male counterparts.
So even when women do have access, it's not necessarily the ideal or most supportive kind of access. What are the implications of that for their learning?
Yeah, it's a crucial question to consider, and something this research really highlights. But before we dive deeper into all of that, there's one more layer I think we need to peel back here. The influence of parents.
Oh, interesting. Okay, so we're talking about the it takes a village effect, or in this case, maybe more like the it starts at home effect.
Exactly. The researchers found what they call the intergenerational effect, which boils down to this. Students whose parents went to university are more likely to have a computer and internet access at home themselves. And this pattern holds true whether those students live in an urban or a rural area.
That is fascinating. See, that's what I love about research like this. It challenges your assumptions because you might think, oh, well, those families probably just have more money for computers and gadgets, but it seems like it goes deeper than that.
Yeah, it really does. It suggests that it's not just about money. It's about how parents who've experienced higher education themselves might view technology and its value for their own children's learning.
Right. So it all circles back to this idea that access isn't just about physical things. It's about those attitudes and resources, those beliefs, even that get passed down through generations.
Absolutely.
It makes you think, right? How has your own upbringing shaped your relationship with technology? But we can save that conversation for another deep dive.
Definitely.
For now, let's get back to those different experiences that students are having based on their digital access. We've talked a lot about the access itself, but I'm curious to unpack what that access actually provides to students. You know what I mean? What's the difference between having access at home versus having to rely on, say, public Wi-Fi at a library or a UNISA center?
It's such a key distinction because just having a computer and internet connection is only one piece of the puzzle. The quality of that access, that environment that you're in when you're trying to learn online, all of that plays such a huge role in how effective online learning can actually be.
Totally. It's like the difference between trying to write a paper in a bustling coffee shop versus, your quiet home office. One is definitely more conducive to thinking deeply and absorbing information. What does the research say about those different learning environments?
Well, one of the big takeaways is that having that home access it offers a lot more than just convenience. It gives students a learning environment where they have privacy, they have control over their study time, and they have the freedom to work late into the night without distractions if they need to. There's this great quote from a 35-year-old female student in the study. She was actually able to continue her UNISA studies after moving from South Africa to Malaysia because her learning wasn't tethered to a specific physical location.
That's amazing. It really speaks to how the right kind of access can open doors and create opportunities that wouldn't otherwise be possible. But what about those students who do have to rely on those public access points? How does that impact their ability to succeed?
That's where those limitations of public access become really clear. Imagine trying to have a super focused study session in a crowded internet cafe. Maybe there are time restrictions on the computers, privacy concerns, download limits. It's not exactly a recipe for, deep learning, is it?
Not exactly an ideal study sanctuary. It sounds like even when efforts are made to provide access, there's still a big difference between basic access and truly equitable access that supports quality learning. So what can be done to bridge that gap?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's one we'll unpack more deeply in the next part of our deep dive.
It's almost like we're talking about two different UNISAs.
Right.
One for the students who have that privilege of home access.
Yeah.
Where they can actually, really dig into their studies.
Mm-hmm.
And then another one for those students who are having to piece together internet time and quiet spaces wherever they can find them.
Yeah, and I think that's why this research is so important.
Right.
Because it reveals these disparities within a system that, on the surface,
Right.
might appear to be offering an equal opportunity.
Totally, because access in and of itself isn't enough.
Exactly.
It's the quality of that access, right?
Yeah.
Like the context that really makes a difference.
Think about it this way. If you're a student and you're trying to write a research paper,
Okay.
but you're having to do it on a shared computer at a UNISA center,
Right.
maybe there's limited software, the internet's a bit dodgy,
Yeah.
and you've got this time limit looming over your head.
Yeah. Talk about a recipe for stress and frustration. It's no wonder that the study found that the students who had that home access generally had a much more positive experience with distance learning overall.
It comes down to having a space that is conducive to deep work
Right.
and to focus learning. And unfortunately, for a lot of students, especially those in those rural areas or from disadvantaged backgrounds, that kind of space is a luxury.
Yeah. It's like trying to run a marathon with one shoe untied.
Exactly.
Like you might technically be in the race, but you're definitely not operating at your full potential.
And this is where I think that the recommendations that the study makes for policymakers and educational institutions become so relevant.
Okay.
Because we need to move beyond just providing access.
Right.
We need to think about how do we create these more equitable learning environments for all students.
So what does that look like in a practical sense? Are we talking about giving every student a laptop and high-speed internet?
I mean, that would be fantastic.
Right.
But it's not always feasible,
Sure.
especially in resource-constrained contexts.
Right.
But there are other steps we can take.
Like what? Give us the good stuff.
Well, for starters, we can look at expanding access to affordable,
Okay.
reliable internet service.
Right. Because what good is a free laptop if you can't even get online?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then we also need to think about the digital literacy gap.
Oh, I
So
remember.
it's not enough to just give someone a device.
Right.
We need to equip them with the skills and the knowledge
Right.
to actually use it effectively.
Totally. So more investment in those digital literacy programs, and not just, within schools and universities, but like thinking about community centers. Absolutely.
Libraries, all of that.
100%.
And then I would also imagine those support systems are hugely important, right?
Huge.
So like mentorship programs or study groups, just creating that sense of community so students don't feel so isolated.
And that's such a good point, because sometimes technology can make you feel isolated,
Yeah.
but it can also be such a powerful tool for connection when it's used in that way.
Totally. And that's what it's all about, right?
Yeah.
Using technology to create a more inclusive and equitable learning experience for everyone.
100%.
Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground here today, but I think if our listeners take away one thing from this conversation, it's that the digital divide is a super complex issue, and there are no easy answers.
For sure. But that doesn't mean it's insurmountable.
Like by understanding the issue and the nuances of digital access and acknowledging that learners have different needs and embracing innovation and collaboration,
Yeah.
we can create a more equitable digital future.
I love that, an equitable digital future. Now, there's one more really interesting piece of the study I want to make sure we touch on before we wrap up.
Okay.
And it's this call for geography educators to really step up and play a role in addressing the digital divide.
It's fascinating, isn't
It
it?
is. Tell me more.
So the researchers are arguing that geography as a discipline
Okay.
is uniquely positioned to help students understand this really complex issue.
Because it's not just about who has access to technology, right? It's about where they live, their socioeconomic background, all those geographical factors.
Exactly. And geography is all about the relationship between people, places, and technology. And it gives us these tools to analyze these issues.
So how do they actually see this playing out in the classroom? What would it look like for geography teachers to actually bring this issue to life for their students?
They have a couple of really cool suggestions.
Okay.
One is incorporating these lessons about the digital divide into the existing curriculum.
Okay.
So imagine students are mapping Wi-Fi hotspots in their community.
Oh, cool.
Or looking at the relationship between internet access and income levels. Or studying how the digital divide plays out in terms of educational outcomes.
I love that, because it's one thing to read about this stuff in a textbook,
Totally.
but it's totally different to see how it plays out in your own community.
And it's not just about awareness.
Right.
It's about empowering these students to become change makers.
I love that.
So they talk about students designing projects that are aimed at bridging the digital divide,
Okay. Some real world problem solving.
like creating a digital literacy program for senior citizens,
Love it.
or advocating for more affordable internet in underserved communities, or coming up with solutions to connect these remote communities.
That's amazing. It's so action oriented.
It is. It's about moving beyond studying the problem to actually doing something about it.
And I think that's such an important message for students to hear, that they have the power to make a difference.
And when you empower students to be those change makers,
Yes.
you're not just teaching them knowledge.
Right.
You're cultivating empathy and critical thinking,
Absolutely, yes.
social responsibility.
Which are qualities that will serve them well no matter what they do in life.
100%. And who knows? We might just inspire the next generation of tech innovators and policymakers that finally close this digital divide.
Oh, that would be incredible. But for now, I think we've given our listeners a lot to think about and a lot to chew on.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've talked about those complexities, the impact on distance education, those potential pathways towards a more equitable digital future.
It's been a really good conversation.
And we've even touched on this really cool idea of bringing geography into the mix.
Yeah, it's exciting.
So to our listeners, I want to leave you with this final thought.
Okay.
If knowledge is power,
Yeah,
then understanding the digital divide is the first step towards bridging it.
I love that.
It's funny, as we're wrapping up this deep dive, this whole conversation about the digital divide and its impact on education, it really drives home how universal these challenges are, you know? It's not just a South Africa thing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. They hit the nail on the head there. It's like, even though this research is looking at UNISA and it's specifically about South Africa, it really highlights these broader issues that are impacting learners and educators, gosh, all over the world, you know?
Totally. It's like we're all part of this like global classroom in a way. And it makes you realize that we can't just talk about the digital divide. We have to move beyond just acknowledging it and start actually doing something to close the gap.
100%. We can't just keep acting like it's this inevitable thing, this force of nature. This is a problem that we created, which means we can solve it if we choose to.
Yeah, right. So let's talk solutions. Let's say our listeners are out there and they're fired up, they want to make a difference. Where do they even begin?
Honestly, sometimes the most powerful first step is just like starting a conversation, you know? Like talk to your friends, your family, people you work with about the digital divide. Share what you've learned from this episode, you know?
Right, get people talking about it.
Exactly. Raise awareness. Get people thinking critically about how they can be a part of the solution.
Because knowledge is power, right? Or at least it's like the first step towards empowerment.
Right.
What else? What are some other things people can do?
Well, I always tell people, look for ways to get involved in your community. There are so many incredible organizations out there that are doing amazing work in this space. Like, I think nonprofits, community groups, even some tech companies are really starting to step up and focus on expanding internet access, promoting digital literacy, advocating for better tech policies.
That's awesome. So there are all these different ways to plug in, whether you can offer your time, your resources, your voice.
Exactly.
Yep.
And honestly, don't underestimate the impact of those seemingly small actions. Like even just donating an old laptop to a local library or mentoring someone on some basic computer skills. It all makes a difference in the long run, you know?
It all adds up.
Yeah.
It's like that Margaret Mead quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." Ugh, I love that quote so much. It's so true.
It's perfect for this, you know, because that's what it's going to take to solve the digital divide. Collective action. People who are passionate, people who are committed, and people who are willing to work together.
100%.
Okay, so speaking of collective action, let's bring this back to the heart of our conversation today, which is education. We've seen how this issue is playing out for students at UNISA, but this isn't just a distance learning problem, right?
No, not at all. Not anymore. As technology becomes more and more integrated into classrooms, you know, at all levels of education, this digital divide, it's only going to become more of a factor in educational equity. Right, because if certain students are constantly starting behind because they don't have access to the same technology at home or they haven't had the opportunity to build those digital skills, it's going to show up in their learning, right?
Yeah, and it's almost like we're holding those students back. We're preventing them from reaching their full potential. And frankly, that's just not okay.
It's not. So what can we do about it? How do we make sure that all students, regardless of their background or their zip code, how do we make sure they have an equal opportunity to succeed in this increasingly digital world?
I think it's going to require everyone to work together, like educators, policymakers, parents. We need to be advocating for more equitable funding for technology in schools. We need to make sure all students have access to reliable, high-speed internet, not just at school, but at home, too. And honestly, we need to start treating digital literacy like the essential skill that it is.
Yeah, it's like we wouldn't accept a system where only some kids learn to read or only some kids learn to write.
Exactly.
We shouldn't accept a system where only some kids have the opportunity to become digitally fluent.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So to all our listeners out there, let's make a pact right here, right now. Let's be those champions for change. In our homes, in our schools, in our communities, let's demand better. Let's work towards a future where every single student has an equal opportunity to thrive no matter what.
Yes, 100%. Let's do it.
This has been The Deep Dive. We've gone deep into the complexities of the digital divide. We've talked about those hidden inequalities. And hopefully, just hopefully, we've sparked something in you, our listeners, to be a part of the solution.
Absolutely. And remember, change starts with awareness. It starts with understanding. And most importantly, it starts with action.
So don't underestimate the power of your voice, the power of your actions, your power to make a real difference in the world. Thanks for diving deep with us today. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep fighting for progress, and keep believing in the power of collective action.
And never, ever stop learning.
This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.